Hi, welcome back to Tax Sale Insiders. I am Rachel Seidensticker, the COO over at Tax Sale Resources, and I'm here with my brother and the CEO of Tax Sale Resources, Brian Seidensticker. We're back. We're been working through a lot of different subjects, and I'm excited today because we've hit on deeds and we've hit on redeemable deeds, and today we're actually going to talk about tax liens, which of course is, I think, what everyone is initially excited about in this industry. And so let's dig in, Brian. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Absolutely. My pleasure.
Yeah. Let's talk tax lien states. I mean, the basic bones. What are lien states and how do they differ from a deed state?
Yeah, well, I think a tax lien in general, right, versus a tax deed. I always, then there's got the in-between redeemable deed, right, which is this weird state that we throw a lot of things into that bucket. But anyway, on the deed side, you're buying real estate, right? On the lien side, you're buying interest in that property, but you're not buying that property, right? And it's a lien, right? It's a lien on the property like a mortgage. And I like to, use the term, these are essentially micro mortgages. More people are familiar with micro mortgages or a mortgage, right? And how that works. And that's what these are. They're mortgages for very small amounts, and they actually have. Attorneys would probably get mad at me using that because it's not a mortgage technically. It's a lien, like a mortgage, right? And it actually has, in most states, it's a priority over the mortgage. But the whole key is that you're buying interest in that property. You don't have any rights to that property. You don't have any ownership to that property. You're really banking on the fact that somebody's that has the ownership of that property is going to have enough interest in redeeming that lien and paying that interest and paying you back as the lien investors. That's the key difference with liens versus deeds.
Yeah, that's I think that's perfect, and that's where they earn their I guess money, correct? Then is in that interest that they have. So
yeah, it's an interest play, a paper play, right? Not a real estate play, and that's the biggest difference between tax deed investors versus lien investors. Lien investors are more interested in the return on their capital, right? Not interested in owning that real estate. Deed investors are going after it with the intent of owning the real estate and doing something with that real estate after the fact.
Yeah, perfect. And you mentioned earlier redeemable deeds, and I think it's important to address because they kind of tax lien states and redeemable deed states land in the basic same camp, but and some people call them hybrid states. What do you think are the similarities between a tax lien and a redeemable deed state?
Yeah, and there's I'll say nuance of language, right, depending on the state statutes and how we interpret those and defining what a redeemable deed state might be versus a lien state. And I think it comes down to what's the intent of investors in that auction, right? A redeemable deed basically just means people are attending that auction with the intent of owning the real estate, but it comes with a redemption period. And the best examples I can use are Georgia, Texas, where you're attending the auction. Most investors are attending the auction with the intent of owning that real estate. That's how the amount that they're bidding. That's the amount of research they need to do. But there's always a chance that it might redeem, right? And so it comes with this redemption period, hence the term redeemable deed. It is similar with liens in the fact that there is a redemption period, but the differentiator and why we peel out redeemable deeds separate from liens is really the intent of the ownership of that piece of paper, which would be the lien, right, and wanting to the interest, right, and the income from earning interest versus wanting to own the real estate. That'd be the biggest difference between the two.
Okay. Are there any states that you would consider in the a more closely related camp to tax liens, where it's you might get the real estate, but is it more difficult to get the real estate like a lien state might be?
Yeah, well, there's, as you know, there's lien states that don't have any other, types of auctions. There's, hybrid states that have both types of auctions. There's, all sorts of different ways of creating, I say hybrid. What does that mean? It could be that they have a lien auction and a deed auction. It could be they have a lien auction, a deed auction, and a redeemable deed auction. All three, right? That happens. But the liens, example states that are pretty common. Colorado is a pretty common lien state. New Jersey is pretty common. Florida is one of those that I'd call a hybrid. It has both liens and deed auctions, but it's a very common lien auction state. And there's many others. There's actually, I believe, 30 states as of this year that hold lien auctions. Many of those end up having a follow-up auction, and so we'd call them hybrid states. But there's many states out there that have a lien auction.
Gotcha. Okay. So can you speak to the redemption period as a requirement in a tax lien state? Basically, what does this mean to an investor versus the property owner? Kind of, this is what it's the benefits to a property owner. This is the benefits to an investor.
Yeah, and again, I'll always caveat stuff with definitely read the statutes in the state you're in. Definitely talk to a local counsel that's familiar with those statutes. But in general, for liens, the redemption period really comes down to how long does the property owner have to pay those delinquent taxes, as well as how long does that lien earn interest, during the term, right? So, using states like Arizona, I believe, is a 3-year redemption period, and actually can go longer than that if nobody redeems it and you decide to do nothing with it. Florida is another good example where it's a 22-month minimum redemption period on that lien, but actually can go out to 7 years, right? So as the lien holder, you have to initiate the next step, right? You can do that at 22 months, but you can also wait up to 7 years. Now, I'm not saying wait 7 years because you have to be done with the whole process by 7 years. So you gotta start it a little ahead of that. But it's the period that is earning interest, right? And then also the period that the property owner has the right to redeem the property, hence the redemption period term. Now the ultimately, some investors prefer to stretch that redemption period out if they have that option. Some investors prefer to make it as short as possible. So it really just depends on what the investor's model is.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us into our next topic, actually, because the benefit to letting it go as long as possible would be earning that beloved interest rate, correct? So how do the interest rates vary in each state? And I guess most importantly, who determines the interest rate in each state to start with?
Well, it's not the investor. So
they don't get to
out there.
A nice 50% return. What? I mean,
no. Typically, it's always governed by state statute. I am aware there's a couple of states where they actually give some leeway to the local municipality on what that rate is going to be, but whoever determines it is never the investor, right? And so you're having to calculate your interest based on what those states' rules are or the county's rules are. Those rates vary, right? And I guess statutorily, there's pretty high rates out there, right? Texas, which is actually a redeemable deed, is 24%. Illinois, which I think has changed recently, but it's based on a 6-month. It's odd, right? You got to read the statute 3 times, but it's all on 6-month terms, so you got to double it, and it's still, I believe it's still 30% or more if statutorily. But again, you got to read between the lines because the way the auction is held is you're bidding down in that interest, right? So what you as an investor actually get is not going to be the state statute maximum. Typically, it's going to be whatever you bid it at. Even in states where the interest is fixed, right? In Colorado, it's I think it's LIBOR plus 10%, right? Now you're bidding a premium, right? So the premium you're bidding doesn't earn interest, and so it's cutting into that ultimate interest you may get back on those that perform. And so it's a complicated calculation. I think on average, right, investors, it really depends on what asset class they're after, right? There's typically interest rates are higher on, I'll say, vacant land versus single family homes versus commercial properties. You can also see there's kind of a sweet spot in the interest earned. A sweet spot meaning the lowest is typically a sweet spot of single family homes, with taxes between $2,000 and $8,000, right? And then you start to get into price ranges that maybe not every investor can participate in, and so rates can go up, and for really high liens, and then at the other end, typically very low, tax amounts, I should say, for less than $500, right? There's not a whole lot of bidders typically for those because the amount of interest you stand to earn is just lower, right? Lower dollar amounts. And so there's a sweet spot where people pursue, and overall the competition is higher in that sweet spot, and so the rates are lower. So, there's certainly ways of boiling it down, right? But it varies. It certainly varies from asset class. It varies across counties. It varies across states, right? It even varies across, how those auctions are managed, right? Whether conducted live or online. All of that has bearing on what that interest rate eventually ends up being.
Which live versus online is usually about competition, right? How many investors are able to participate. So yeah,
exactly.
All right. So in the big scheme of things, we've talked about there's this redemption period, and during that redemption period is where they're earning their interest. And if they're not wanting to own the property, you want to kind of find that sweet spot and hope that a property owner redeems at a certain time. So you're not having to then initiate any next steps, right? Which would be a whole nother topic for the foreclosure process, which we will leave alone in this particular conversation. But what happens if the property doesn't redeem? What happens?
Well, and again, it varies from one state to the next, but typically what happens is the investor has to do something, right? Whether in Florida, you file what's called a TDA, tax deed application, again, initiated by the investor, which takes it to the next step. Typically there's additional taxes that need to be paid as part of that process, a form that needs to be filled out, and really says, okay, this is back to Florida. I, as a lien investor, am ready to get out of this investment, right, and initiate the tax deed sale process, which culminates in the sale of the tax deed, the real estate, but the investor needs to start that process. Again, they have the right to do that at 22 months, but they have up to 7 years to complete that process. There are other states where there's not a secondary deed auction. I'll go back to Illinois. At the end of the redemption period, you have the right to extend it, right? They call them extensions. Again, this is specific to Illinois, but at some point you have to then take the next step. Now, Illinois doesn't have a secondary deed auction, right? So the next step is basically starting to notify everybody, and eventually culminates in a judge saying that you get a deed to the property, right? So, but there's no auction in that process. And there's several other different, variations of those two types of processes, but it's always the investor that has to do something. It's not like you can sit there and wait, and at the end of the day, you get a deed in the mail. At least I'm not aware of a state that operates that way and that efficiently. The investor needs to understand at what point they need to take that next step. And a lot of times they are governed by statutes when and how, and really how quickly they have to, or how much they have to wait, right? So that's, again, talking to a local attorney that can help advise you when you need to do those certain steps, what you can and can't do is highly advisable.
Yeah, those notification processes can be pretty sticky in certain states. So
exactly.
There. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, tax liens, there's tax lien sales, which is what you've been focused on, right? You go to the sale, you're usually bidding down your interest rate. You're not getting an interest in the property. You're waiting your redemption period, and hopefully you're, gaining on your portfolio. But is there any other way to purchase tax liens directly from maybe an investor who has already bought liens?
There are. Well, in most states, you can what's called assign the lien that you purchased, right? So let's say investor A goes to the auction and purchases those liens, right? The investor A has the right of assigning that lien to another investor, right? And that's what we call secondary market transaction. Basically, the investor A says, hey, I will sell to you, investor B, this lien, right? And for a price. And then there's an assignment of that lien that needs to be done, with the county, right? And forms you got to fill out, and to do that. And there's just, that varies, from state to state, county to county. That can be done. Now, in general, it doesn't happen very often, typically because the investor A goes to the auction, right? Because they want to own that lien, right? Now, historically, there were investors that really didn't want to own real estate that were going to lien auctions. And so when it started to get toward the end of that redemption period, they were looking for other investors to now buy that lien and take it the rest of the way, through the process, maybe own some of that real estate and do what they need to from a real estate perspective. What we've seen in the industry in the last 8 years is a shift in that, right? So the lien investors now are much more likely to want that real estate as well. And so they're a lot less likely to sell those liens on the secondary market. There are exceptions to that. There are certainly instances where, there's capital, access to capital needed to take that next step maybe be an issue, right? And so they're looking to sell, and they're good liens, right? Just take somebody that has that extra cash to go through that next step. Or, right, there's probably a more common situation where the lien, they found at some point in time, the lien isn't a very good quality, right? And so they don't want to own a lien or a piece of property of that particular quality, right? And so opting to sell it now. That doesn't mean that it's always worthless, right? That certainly happens, but one man's trash is another man's treasure. If you have a model for that particular type of lien, then you might be able to get great deals on the secondary market.
Great. Cool. I guess tell us what you think what things an investor should be wary of in tax lien states. And is there a particular state that you think, an investor should be especially cautious? Just some cons basically of tax liens in general.
Well, I think common things that all investors should look out for, right? If you're new to the industry, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that these are guaranteed, and that is furthest from the truth. The counties and municipalities do not guarantee anything. They don't intentionally try to get one over on you, but there's nothing that says a lien on a mailbox, will be reimbursed, if you can't make anything off it, right? There's one state that has an exception to that. Illinois actually has some statutes to allow you to get your money back for what they term to be worthless liens. But in general, most states do not do that, right? So do not assume that this is guaranteed. Don't make uneducated decisions to buy certain liens. You need to do your research. So that's number one. Number two is assuming that this lien is going to end up as real estate. In reality, there's a very, very small percentage of liens that end up as real estate. That's why tax deed investors typically go to the tax deed auctions, because that's the intent of those. On the lien side, the chance of getting that real estate is very, very low. And so that you shouldn't go into a situation, say, I'm going to buy this lien on a property, buy one lien, and assume that you're going to end up owning that property in 3 years. I don't know exactly what the chances are, but it's like buying a lottery ticket, assuming that you're going to win that lottery. Can it happen? Sure. But is that a good investment model? No.
Okay. Great. Anything else?
I think the other big one would be knowing what the requirements during that redemption period are. And that just comes down to talking to a local attorney and understanding, like, what are my notification requirements? What are my things I can't do? What are the things I should do? Things I have to do? Because in many states, if you miss any of those things, that lien now becomes worthless, right? Because you need to know that stuff ahead of time.
Yeah. I would also put a small plug in saying that due diligence, don't overlook the importance of due diligence for liens. So
exactly.
They're just as important, because, as Brian said, you're not guaranteed property ownership, but when you do, you better hope you like the property that you're buying. So,
yep.
All right. So, and the vice versa, there would be pros. Are there any highly sought after states, and why would they be more sought after than others? What are some big pros to this side of the business?
Boy, that's a loaded question, because it really just comes down to what is your model, right? Are you wanting, say, the highest return? Even that comes down to, my immediate answer was go to the live auctions, right? Or go to auctions where they're all held on the same day, right? Those are two ways of eliminating a lot of competition. And so maybe targeting those sales, you'll get a little better return. There are certainly advantages, depending on what your model is, to owning the real estate, to the return that you get, to maybe your risk, right? And what I mean by that is the advantage of a lien versus a deed, right? From a risk standpoint, is the amount you're investing in each lien is usually a fraction of the amount that you would invest as a deed investor in each property, right? So your risk is slightly lower. That's, I guess, call that a pro or an advantage versus deeds. But that is always the case, and there's certainly some states where that percentage is higher than other states, right? So I probably sound like I'm avoiding the question, and I am on purpose, because the true answer is there is not a state that I would say, go here, this is the best return you can get. And quite frankly, even if I did know that answer and gave that answer, that'll change as soon as I give that answer, because every investor will be going to that state. So we're not in the position to really say where to go. It really depends on defining what your model is. And if I had an investor that came to me and said, I'm after this, and they were extremely specific about that, I'm after vacant land that is 5 to 10 acres, that is in the middle of nowhere, right, and as a lien, right, we can help guide those questions in the right direction. But that's a very different question than where am I going to get the best return.
Yeah. And I'll double down and say highly sought after in my mind for definition is, you have your states that just have a lot of product, and that would be Florida. It has probably the most product as a state as a whole in the tax lien world. But it's also the most highly competitive. So you have to balance that out, right?
Very true. Very true.
So do you have any investing strategies you think investors should consider for lien states specifically?
Not like a specific, hey, here's a model, go implement it. But I will say there's definitely been a shift in the lien investor's mentality from not wanting real estate to wanting real estate. And I see the competition being as competitive as it is, and it's not going to get any better, right? If anything, it'll get more competitive. If you're not baking in that as part of your model, meaning owning some percentage of real estate and having the ability to disposition that real estate at a significant profit, if that's not part of your model, then chances are you're not going to survive against the funds out there that do have that built in. So as a lien investor, always go into it with in mind, hey, is this a piece of property I'd want to end up owning in the end, right? Because chances are one out of every so many, right, roughly 3% of liens sold end up as real estate. So if you're buying on any sort of scale, you're going to end up owning it. And if your goal is to not own it, then you're probably not going to make enough on the rest to really justify, right? So that has been a big shift in roughly the last 8 years, is making sure you've got a real estate component to your model for sure.
Okay. You want to touch on at all over the counter? Because I feel like that is an interesting tax lien kind of investment strategy as well. That's not typical. Yeah. Over the counter, right, just to reiterate, is basically the ability to buy liens, from the jurisdiction directly, not having to go, to an auction. Hence over the counter. Now, in the general consensus is that, well, they're there because nobody else bought the lien, right? And so it's junk, right, I guess is the term that you hear. And that, may be the case for a lot of it, but that doesn't mean that's the case for all of it. And so, if you're looking to just get into the big advantage, right, of OTC liens is there is no competition, right? It's first come, first serve, right? You're not bidding down interest rates. So interest rates are typically max they can possibly be on those liens. But you definitely need to do your research because somebody else has passed on it, or in some cases, didn't know about it or didn't have the data to make the decision, right? Those would be what the diamonds in the rough are. They're still good investments, but you got to identify those because those aren't going to be the norm. They're going to be the exception. And so you just need to go in with that in mind. But there's certainly great investments for starter investors, right? You're not going to place $100 million in OTC liens, right, with good liens, nationwide. But could you place, a few $100,000, a few $1 million, if done well? I think you could. Okay. Well, I know this is a complicated question, but if you were to give investors some tips, how would you best help them be competitive in today's investment landscape that exists? Yeah, I think
I come back to this all the time. Selecting your model of what you're actually looking to pursue, I'd say the more defined you can be, probably the more successful you'll be, right? Because if you can target a very specific niche of liens, then you can probably be a little more competitive because maybe what your end game is slightly different than everyone else. So you can maybe bid it a little more aggressive than everybody else, right? And so you end up owning a little more than everyone else. And if you go to an auction, it used to be I go to the auction and I'm going to buy anything that I think has a value, and I think that concept still applies to some extent, but so it does for so many large investors out there. And typically those large investors have a source of capital that is, much more favorable to them than maybe what you do, right? So they're usually willing to be a little more competitive than most smaller investors. And so I always, as a new entrance into the arena, if you're buying liens, is to maybe target a very specific niche of lien or a very specific market that might have less competition, right? More rural areas versus urban areas, states that have live auctions in general versus online auctions, right? Because everybody can participate in online auctions, then the competition's insane. Those would be the few general recommendations I would have that would get you a lot further without having to learn those lessons yourself. And I think the biggest frustration for investors is doing all of this research, going to an auction, with this picture of grandeur in their mind of I'm going to win all of these liens, and then they get outbid on 99% of them, right? Knowing that's going to be the reality, you're going to have to do it on a larger scale, and you're going to have to use pretty sophisticated tools to let you underwrite a lot, right, in that specific niche of liens that you're after. But that's exactly what we do. We're enabling investors to do that on a larger scale.
Yeah, and on that note, just a little plug for us, but do you feel like there's any particular data sets or new data that we have that might people should consider in making these decisions, especially in our more competitive environment that exists?
Well, like the biggest, the two things that we have, one, tool, right? The research tool itself allows you to underwrite on a massive scale, right? So if you're after, I always use this example, but commercial property worth $5 million and up, right? Looking for those in a county can be hard, right? You can wait a long time and never see that come across, especially if you're somewhere where that only has an auction once a year. That opportunity comes and goes, right? But if you're willing to say, hey, if I could come across those, but I don't buy them anywhere, that the only tool that we're familiar with that can do that is our research tool that basically allows you to say, I'm after a specific type of lien like that. You set a notification, and every time it shows up in an auction across the country, it notifies you. That's a pretty incredible tool. That's just one example.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, any parting wisdom before we head out? I think you certainly covered tax liens as a general. I will stress with Brian, always check out and research local attorneys to learn the ins and outs, because each state is different. So I will piggyback on that knowledge that you shared, Brian, because I think it's important that we continue to push people that direction. But do you have any wisdom that you want to impart before we leave?
Nothing different than I've already said. I mean, definitely have a strategy in mind, and definitely do your homework, definitely do your due diligence, ask the questions of the attorneys, and know what you're doing before you dive in. I think the worst stories we've heard are people hear of it, I don't know, through a seminar or through a webinar or through radio ad, right? They hear all the things that might be true, but are, again, exceptions, not the norm. They go to an auction, they buy all these things, and then they've got nightmare stories of buying things that they thought were guaranteed, and then lo and behold, it's a stretch of sidewalk, it's a mailbox, it's a property that had a demolition lien on it. Now they've inherited that demolition lien. These are all things, real things that you need to be concerned about. So knowing what you're after, but then also knowing what to avoid, right? And understanding how the process works by talking to an attorney that's familiar with it are all key components of being successful.
Right. Well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. And we're glad that all of you could join us here for another episode of Tax Sale Insiders. Keep checking back. We'll continue to have content. We're going to be bringing Brian back more and more and more with different subjects that he can impart his wisdom. So anyway, thanks, Brian.
Can't wait.
Yeah, okay.
Good luck, everybody.
Happy investing.